And it's not just any celebration, Mr. Johnson added, his voice growing stronger. It's about something far bigger than you or me or this backyard, something that explains everything. Everyone leaned in, holding their breath, waiting for the revelation that would change everything. The moment felt electric, and there was no turning back now. Whatever Mr. Johnson was about to reveal would either shatter the tension or ignite it into something unstoppable. The air seemed heavier as everyone leaned in, waiting for Mr. Johnson to explain. His words carried a weight that no one could ignore, and even Mr. Peterson, though still scowling, looked uneasy. But just as Mr. Johnson opened his mouth to speak, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the silence. Heads turned as a sleek black sedan rolled to a stop in front of the Johnsons' house. Out stepped a man in a sharp suit, his presence commanding immediate attention. The crowd whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of the sudden interruption. The man adjusted his tie and walked toward the backyard with purpose. As he approached, Mr. Johnson smiled faintly, almost as if he'd been expecting this. The man extended his hand, and Mr. Johnson shook it firmly. "Perfect timing," Mr. Johnson said, his voice calm but tinged with a knowing edge. He turned back to the crowd, his eyes locking on Mr. Peterson. "Before I continue, let me introduce someone very important, Mr. Daniels." The name didn't mean much to most of the neighbors, but the way Mr. Peterson's face drained of color suggested otherwise. His arms, once crossed defiantly, now hung loosely at his sides. He stammered, What is he doing here?" Mr. Daniels stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on Mr. Peterson. "I'm here because Mr. Johnson asked me to be," he said simply, his tone measured but firm. "And judging by the situation, I'd say it was a good call." The murmurs grew louder. Who was this man, and why was Mr. Peterson reacting like he'd seen a ghost? Mr. Johnson took a deep breath and addressed the crowd again. "You see, Mr. Daniels isn't just a family friend. He's a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. He specializes in cases involving discrimination and harassment." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Mr. Peterson's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for words but couldn't find them. The tension thickened as Mr. Johnson continued. "I thought it might be wise to have him here today, considering your history, Mr. Peterson. After all, this isn't the first time you've caused trouble, is it?" The neighbors exchanged wide-eyed glances. Whispers spread quickly. What history? What had Mr. Peterson done? Mr. Daniels stepped closer to Mr. Peterson, his voice low but cutting. "Do you want to explain, or should I?" The backyard was dead silent again, the weight of the moment suffocating. Whatever was about to be revealed would turn this conflict into something far bigger than a backyard barbecue. The stakes had never been higher, and the crowd could feel that the truth was about to explode. But no one, not even Mr. Peterson, was ready for what was coming next. Mr. Peterson's face turned pale as he fidgeted under the weight of Mr. Daniels' piercing gaze. The backyard, once filled with the cheerful sounds of a family barbecue, was now eerily quiet. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for answers, and it was clear that Mr. Peterson had no escape from the spotlight now. "All right," Mr. Daniels began, his tone calm but firm. "Since you don't seem eager to explain, I'll do it for you." He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying with the weight of authority. "What most of you don't know is that Mr. Peterson here has a documented history of filing complaints against families like the Johnsons, families who don't look like him. There have been multiple incidents in other neighborhoods where his actions have been called into question." Gasps spread through the crowd, and the murmur of disbelief grew louder. Mr. Peterson stammered, That's not true. You can't prove anything." But his voice lacked conviction, and beads of sweat had formed on his forehead. Mr. Johnson stepped forward then, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Actually, we can't," he said, his tone steady. He nodded toward Mr. Daniels, who reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are records of the complaints you filed, all targeting families who just so happen to share one thing in common, their background." The neighbors, who had once sided with Mr. Peterson on minor grievances, were now looking at him with a mix of shock and disgust. Even his closest allies were taking a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the revelation. But just as it seemed the story was wrapping up, Mr. Johnson smiled faintly, his next words taking everyone by surprise. "There's something else you should know," he said, his voice calm yet powerful. "This barbecue isn't just a celebration, it's a reunion. And the reason we're all here today is because, after years of searching, we found something incredible. Mr. Peterson, you might want to listen closely to this part." The crowd leaned in, the suspense almost unbearable. "We found out," Mr. Johnson continued, "that my family has roots in this neighborhood that go back generations. In fact, your property used to belong to my great-grandparents." The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Peterson's mouth dropped open, and for a moment, it seemed like he couldn't even process what he'd just heard. The neighbors were stunned, their shock now turning to a kind of poetic justice. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, his voice steady and filled with pride. "So you see, we're not just new neighbors. We're part of this community's history, a history you've tried to erase with your prejudice, but we're not going anywhere." The crowd erupted into applause, their support for the Johnson family clear. Mr. Peterson, now completely defeated, muttered something under his breath before retreating to his house, his shoulders slumped. As the barbecue resumed, the Johnson family stood together, surrounded by neighbors who had finally seen the truth. It wasn't just about a barbecue, it was about reclaiming their place, their story, and their right to belong. And in the end, it was clear. The Johnsons weren't just part of the neighborhood, they were the neighborhood. As the laughter and conversation filled the backyard once again, it was clear that the mood had completely shifted. What had started as a tense confrontation had turned into a powerful moment of unity and understanding. The neighbors, many of whom had kept to themselves for years, now mingled freely, sharing stories and offering words of support to the Johnson family. It was a scene that felt more like a true community than ever before. Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor, walked over to Mr. Johnson with a warm smile. "You handled that with such grace," she said, patting his arm. "I've seen a lot of things in this neighborhood, but today you reminded everyone what really matters." Mr. Johnson smiled back, his gratitude evident. "Thank you," he said softly. "We just want to live in peace, like everyone else." As the sun began to set, the Johnson children ran around with the other kids, their laughter ringing out like music. Mrs. Johnson sat with a few neighbors, swapping recipes and talking about their families. Even those who had previously kept their distance were now opening up, as if the day's events had broken down invisible walls. Meanwhile, Mr. Peterson's house remained quiet. His blinds were drawn, and no one had seen him since he stormed off. Some whispered about whether he'd learned anything from what had happened, but most agreed it didn't matter. The Johnsons had made their point, and the support they now had from the community was undeniable. As the barbecue wound down, Mr. Johnson stood to thank everyone for coming. "Today was about more than just food or family," he said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and pride. "It was about standing up for what's right and showing that no matter what, kindness and truth will always win. We're grateful to be part of this neighborhood and hope this is the start of something better for all of us." The crowd cheered, clapping and raising their glasses. As the Johnson family cleaned up and the last guests headed home, they knew they had not only reclaimed their space, but also strengthened their bond with the community. It wasn't just a barbecue, it was a new beginning. It was supposed to be a day of joy, laughter, and family. The smell of grilled burgers and sizzling hot dogs filled the air. Kids were running around with balloons, and the family's backyard buzzed with warmth and togetherness. But then, things took a turn no one expected. Meet the Johnsons, a hardworking and loving family who always found ways to bring their relatives and friends together. On this sunny weekend, they decided to host a barbecue, a tradition in their quiet neighborhood. But not everyone was excited about it. Their neighbor, Mr. Peterson, had always kept his distance, sending disapproving glares their way whenever they had guests over. This time, though, He wasn't just watching from behind his curtains. He decided to take matters into his own hands. As the music played and laughter echoed, Mr. Peterson stormed into the yard, his face red with anger. He claimed the gathering was too loud and accused the Johnsons of disturbing the peace. It didn't take long for his true colors to show, as his words turned uglier, dripping with racist remarks that left everyone stunned. The family and their guests tried to stay calm, but tension was thick in the air. But here's where the story takes a surprising twist. As the confrontation escalated, Mr. Johnson, the father and host of the barbecue, calmly stepped forward. He didn't shout, he didn't retaliate. Instead, he shared a revelation that left everyone speechless, even Mr. Peterson. It was a truth so unexpected, so powerful, that it would not only change the course of that day, but shake the neighborhood to its core. What could Mr. Johnson possibly reveal that turned the situation upside down? What secret could silence a man fueled by prejudice? Stay tuned to find out how one family's courage and compassion transformed an ugly confrontation into an unforgettable moment. This is a true story you won't want to miss. As the backyard fell silent, all eyes were on Mr. Johnson. The usually soft-spoken father of two had a calm but intense expression on his face, the kind that demanded attention without raising his voice. He stood tall, his hands still holding a spatula, as he looked straight at Mr. Peterson. For a moment, the tension felt unbearable. Even the kids, sensing the gravity of the situation, had stopped playing and gathered near their parents. "I hear what you're saying," Mr. Johnson began, his tone steady but firm. "And I think it's time we clear a few things up." Everyone was surprised by his response. It wasn't defensive or confrontational, but it carried a weight that suggested he had something important to say. Before anyone could interrupt, he gestured toward the crowd and continued. "You see, we've lived in this neighborhood for years. We've kept to ourselves, respected the rules, and treated everyone with kindness. And yet, here we are." Mr. Peterson folded his arms, glaring back. "What's your point?" he snapped. Mr. Johnson smiled faintly, a mix of patience and determination. "My point," he said, pausing for effect, "is that maybe you don't know as much about us as you think you do." He glanced over at his wife and kids, who stood close by, their faces a mix of pride and curiosity. At this point, the neighbors who had gathered at the commotion began whispering among themselves. Who was Mr. Johnson, really? What was this secret he was hinting at? Even the guests, many of whom had known the family for years, exchanged puzzled looks. "I've seen people like you before," Mr. Johnson continued, his voice unwavering. "People who think they know someone just by looking at them, but there's always more to the story." The suspense was almost too much to bear. What could he possibly reveal that would change everything? No one could have guessed the truth that was about to come to light. The silence stretched as everyone leaned in, waiting for the moment that would redefine their understanding of the man standing before them. The crowd was still, their curiosity growing by the second. Even Mr. Peterson seemed caught off guard, his earlier anger now replaced by confusion and a flicker of unease. Mr. Johnson let the silence linger for just a moment longer before he spoke again. "You see," he began, his voice steady, "what you don't know about me, about us, is that I've been through more than you could imagine. And yet, here I am, trying to live a peaceful life with my family." His gaze swept across the crowd, making sure his words landed. "But some people," he added, his tone tightening, "think they have the right to judge, to make assumptions, just because of what they see on the surface." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward then, standing beside her husband. Her calm demeanor mirrored his, but there was a fire in her eyes as she addressed Mr. Peterson directly. "We've dealt with people like you before," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "People who think they can push us out or make us feel like we don't belong. But let me tell you something, you don't scare us." Mr. Peterson's face hardened, his arms tightening across his chest. "This has nothing to do with belonging," he argued, though his voice lacked the conviction it held earlier. "It's about respecting the neighborhood. You're disturbing everyone." But before he could say more, one of the Johnsons' neighbors, An elderly woman named Mrs. Carter spoke up, disturbing everyone. She scoffed, stepping closer to the group. "I've lived next door to this family for years, and I've never had a single complaint. Maybe the problem isn't the barbecue. Maybe it's you." Her words sparked murmurs among the onlookers, many of whom nodded in agreement. For years, Mr. Peterson had a reputation for being difficult, but no one had ever openly challenged him. Now, with the spotlight on him, he seemed to falter, his confidence wavering. But just as it seemed the tide was turning, Mr. Johnson spoke again, this time with a look of determination. "Before we go any further," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter, "there's something I need to say, something that might explain everything." The crowd leaned in, the suspense growing thicker with every word. What was he about to reveal? And why did it feel like this moment was about to change everything? The answer was just within reach, but no one could guess what was coming next. The crowd grew restless, their curiosity bubbling over into quiet murmurs. Even the children, normally oblivious to adult drama, were clutching their parents' hands, sensing that something big was about to happen. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, glancing at his wife and then at his children, as if silently preparing them for what he was about to say. But before he could continue, Mr. Peterson, clearly feeling his grip on the situation slipping, interrupted. "What are you even talking about?" he snapped, his voice louder now, tinged with frustration. "What could you possibly have to say that matters? This is about you disrupting the peace, not some life story." His words hung in the air, harsh and dismissive, but his posture betrayed his unease. Mr. Johnson didn't flinch. If anything, his resolve seemed to harden. He tilted his head slightly, studying the man in front of him. "You think you know what this is about," he said calmly, "but you don't. Not even close." At that moment, the crowd began shifting physically and emotionally. Neighbors who had mostly stayed on the sidelines started stepping closer, their expressions a mix of curiosity and quiet support for the Johnson family. Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor who had spoken up earlier, folded her arms, watching Mr. Peterson with a sharp gaze. Even some of Mr. Peterson's usual allies, those who often grumbled about the smallest inconveniences in the neighborhood, seemed uncertain, their loyalties wavering. "Let me ask you something," Mr. Johnson said, his tone soft yet commanding. "Have you ever stopped to wonder why you feel the need to come over here, shouting and making accusations? Have you ever asked yourself why it bothers you so much that we're simply enjoying time with our family?" Mr. Peterson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The question seemed to land heavier than anyone expected. A flicker of something, was it doubt, crossed his face, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. The silence that followed was palpable, broken only by the distant sound of kids' laughter from another yard. The tension was at its peak, and every second felt longer than the last. Mr. Johnson took a step forward, his voice steady but carrying an intensity that drew everyone in. "What you don't know," he said, his words deliberate and full of weight, "is that this barbecue isn't just a gathering. It's a celebration." The crowd stirred, whispers spreading like wildfire. A celebration of what? No one could piece it together, and Mr. Peterson's scowl deepened as he looked around, realizing he was losing whatever grip he had on the moment.